Welcome to Ivy League Murders, where we deep dive on cases related to academia. My name is Sarah Alcorn. I'm a Harvard graduate and a private investigator.
My name is Laura Rodriguez McDonald. I'm a University of Miami grad, longtime crime aficionado, and part of a fourth-generation NYPD family.
Laura and I don't always agree on everything. With her NYPD roots and my criminal defense background, sometimes we find ourselves on opposite sides of the jury. We do share a mutual passion for crime solving, and we both grew up in Cambridge, steps away from Harvard University. In Ivy League Murders, we discuss cases where the best of the best make the worst decisions. We look at people who seemingly have it all and throw it all away. Cornell University, located in the lush beauty of Ithaca, New York, is known for its international and progressive approach to academics. It was the 1970s. Bell-bottomed students traipsed across the elegant grounds, chatting about majors, smoking pot, and discussing their hopes that Jimmy Carter could maybe bring a real change to American politics. Weaved amongst them was a quiet, awkward agricultural engineering major. He was already stalking, picking out women, following them, and getting a perverse thrill in scaring them. He is Ivy League serial killer named Michael Bruce Ross.
Wow, well, Sarah, we are doing the Cornell serial killer this week, which is a case I always think I'm familiar with most cases. I really was completely unfamiliar with this case.
Absolutely, and I think I just want to remind our listeners that this is a true crime podcast. This is a very brutal, we go into murders, serial murders, sexual violence.
Violence against children.
And it's definitely listener warning.
We really try in this podcast not to dwell on the actual act of violence and to look more at the reasons behind that.
Exactly.
Why don't we just get right to it, Sarah? Thanks for everyone for hanging in there with us. We, with our editor Joe, have put a lot of work into trying to fix our audio, so hopefully things are going to sound a lot better this week.
That's right. And there's tons of people, but they're just in tremendous amounts of support going on, and we're super grateful for that.
This podcast community is...
It's fantastic.
Yeah.
Laura and I were joking around that it's people like from all walks of life. And, Laura and I were joking around like, we are the world, because it's like even like the true crime podcasting world and beyond. What are some of the stranger podcasts that or not stranger, but the themes outside of true crime that you have explored?
There's plumbing podcasts.
I love it.
There is a niche for everybody.
But a couple of your favorites. I think Before Words, I think we got to do a little...
Casey from Before Words. Yeah, I listened to that with Lily, and who's my daughter, who's 18, and it's just so exciting that somebody would get her that into words.
Well, but explain. These are like 5-minute segments of going into the etymology of certain words, and the guy is funny, and he does a great job, and they're like little word candies in a funny way.
Oh, right. I love Zach from Drinks with Great Minds in History. I mean, what a brilliant podcast that is.
And we've had a couple of people do wonderful shout outs and run our promos, Murder and Such, on episode 67, and we listened to it, and fantastic.
I'm a huge Hunter fan. I love Murder and Such, so that's a real honor. And I have to give a shout out to my podcast mentor, Nicole, at Quite Unusual podcast, because she's been so helpful and really walking me through the audio and the day-to-day struggles, and their podcast's phenomenal. Another one I'm able to listen to with my daughter, and we just have a blast listening to the Elisa Lam case together, and it was so well done.
Oh, yeah.
And they're funny, and I'm getting kind of coolness credibility from all these podcasters I'm connected with my daughter, so there's many more.
And there's Backroads as well.
Backroad Legends, phenomenal. HAC.
We are the world.
Ross at Missing Molly. I mean, there's so many, but I could go on and on and on with my Academy Award speech. So let's
talk about Michael Bruce Ross.
Right. Let's get down to some true crime.
Ross was born July 26th in 1959 in Brooklyn, Not the Brooklyn you're thinking of, okay? Brooklyn spelled the same way in Connecticut. And Brooklyn's a small rural town of about 8,000. It was a middle-class farming community, and he was born to a very young couple who were married right out of high school, right? Daniel and Pat Ross.
Weren't they married due to an unplanned pregnancy?
Unplanned pregnancy. And so Pat Ross, his mother, she hated this small rural farm community, and she never stopped really blaming Michael, right, for trapping her in this existence that she hated. And she had 3 more children after that. The marriage was terrible, right? It was super rocky.
And she had some mental illness, and she was hospitalized several times because she had thoughts of suicide and of harming the children. So she was very abusive mentally and physically to Ross. I mean, he was a bedwetter. She used to hang out his sheets to humiliate him.
It's awful. He was a bedwetter until his early teens.
Yeah, until adolescence.
Right? Yes.
She eventually ran off with another man briefly to North Carolina, and then did come back and got hospitalized, but they do eventually get divorced.
And now Ross was sexually assaulted by an uncle at a very young age, right?
I think between like 5 and 8. He was he was raped and sexually abused by his uncle. When Ross was 8, his uncle, who was 16 at the time, committed suicide. And he left a note, and in the note he blamed his suicide on the fact he couldn't live anymore because of his homosexuality.
Oh, so
he didn't admit to the sexual abuse. He
basically blames the victim.
Right.
I think one of the marked things that about Ross is he grew up on this farm, and I think at the age of 8, his job was to pick out the weak chickens and throttle their necks. And he later on says that this was a precursor to his sort of violence later on. Imagine an 8-year-old kid having that duty. I know farm life is farm life. My dad grew up on a farm, and I think there's a certain reality about killing animals when you live on a farm, but I can't imagine assigning that duty to an 8-year-old boy.
Ross, early on, and we know this because he talks about it, he starts to get some sexual satisfaction, some sexual arousal from killing the animals. There's
early on, there's indicators that he's just not,
And there's a connection with sex and violence. So this is something that these obsessive thoughts start for him very young. He says that this starts to happen about this time. So it's not so much, that he had to, in my opinion, kill the animals because he lived on a farm, but it's that he enjoyed killing the animals.
Right. So like indicator number 1, bedwetting, harming animals because that was your job at 8. But he was also highly intelligent. Ross did extremely well in school. He had a high IQ. He was a high achiever, but he gets himself into Cornell at this point.
Yeah, and let's just say about high school, he was able to maintain friendships, he had a relationship.
And we have to say that Ross presented very normally. He was a nice-looking guy. He was mild-mannered. He's frightening because I think if you had met him or he had been in your high school, you would never know what he would become.
Yeah, he reminds me a little bit of Bundy. Not quite as charismatic.
So Cornell, Laura, is basically the perfect hunting ground for Ross. And he's increasingly consumed with violent fantasies. He began stalking women and getting a thrill out of their fear. And so this is Ross in his own chilling words.
Stalk women. Then when I got to college, somehow they started degrading, going into more violent fantasies. That's when my rape fantasies first started, was when I was in college. I started following women home, and I would get a thrill by them knowing that I was following them, that they would be scared, and that gave me a thrill. And then it got to the point where I actually raped someone at Cornell, and then the next person I actually raped and killed.
I understand also Ross also at this time had a serious girlfriend who was a member of the ROTC, which is the military on campus. And she had an unplanned pregnancy, which ended in abortion.
Interestingly, he had a lot of guilt about, because he was raised Catholic, he had this kind of haunted him for the rest of his life. Interesting that he was able to disassociate in some ways, but still have this guilt. And he was also, something you may not know, he was a TA in college, which is a teacher's assistant.
Oh, God, that's terrifying. Yeah.
So he was...
He had plenty of access to young, vulnerable
and
undergrads. The girlfriend takes a commission overseas, and then that relationship ended. So I think he was also triggered by the end of the relationship and also the abortion.
Yeah, this seems to be a theme with him, that he's hurt by women. It triggers a rage that then triggers violent behavior.
Who knows if her classmate Ross even registered to the Pretty Dung Nok 2. 2 was a master graduate who was pursuing a graduate degree in economics at Cornell, and she was a Vietnamese immigrant who wanted to work for international aid organizations to help farmers in developing countries. So I guess Ross and 2 took a class together, and that's how he knew her. As we've mentioned, the breakup and the abortion was a trigger for Ross. So he finally gives in to his desires one night, and he stalked, raped, and strangled 2. He threw her body off of a bridge, Laura. And at first, her death was ruled a suicide.
Where he threw her was a place where there were fairly frequent suicide. It was thought that she had gone there to commit suicide.
Friends and family who knew her were like, no way.
Right.
She's full of life. She's got a great, bright future ahead of her. Then the police, when they recover her body, they find clear signs of strangulation and rape. However, 2's murder went unsolved for years.
We don't get too much into the details, but he had a clear signature, which is that he had them lie on their stomachs and he strangled them from behind.
Manually.
Yeah. So he didn't use a ligature.
But he would often promise them after the rape that he would let them go, and that was not.
Right, and that was his first murder.
Right, so after 2's murder, Ross was consumed with thoughts of suicide and remorse, and he vowed, never to murder again. I think this is what's interesting about Ross as well. I think he really did feel a lot of, remorse and guilt, but he had this compulsion he couldn't help, and so this was 1981. Over the next few years, he doesn't successfully resist his temptation, and he would murder 7 more innocent women. And like you said, he would always use the same signature.
And after he graduates, he moves to Lewiston, North Carolina, which is the home of Purdue Farms. This tiny town has only 630 people in it, Sarah. So he rented a trailer, and he lived there, but he established his stalking grounds, and his stalking began immediately.
We should say, too, that Ross practiced something called geolocation for serial killers, meaning that his hunting grounds, whether he was at Cornell, North Carolina, later on in Connecticut, he doesn't go much more than 3 miles outside of his radius, basically.
Which is common.
So during this period of his life, he happens to be in North Carolina, but his habit of stalking women culminates now October 25th, 1981.
He actually stalks a woman who is walking with her baby, and he attacks her, and she cooperates because he threatens the baby. This is part of his control masochism. He leaves her for dead. He thinks she's dead. However, she does live.
She doesn't identify him until he gets arrested much later on.
Right,
basically.
But eventually she will identify him. So this behavior is obviously continuing and escalating. And at a seminar in Illinois, Ross got restless. He started wandering the streets. And he comes across Priscilla, who's a local 15-year-old, and she notices him following her and tries to avoid him. But he actually grabs her, Sarah, in broad daylight. She screams as she's dragged into the woods. And fortunately for her, somebody heard the scream and called the police.
That's right, and I think he was arrested for that.
Yes, right. So and he winds up getting arrested, but he's only arrested for assault, but he gets 2 months probation.
I think that people, thank God, take assault a lot more seriously these days. I think it was kind of not taken as seriously.
No, it definitely was.
So he returns to Connecticut. He's living with his parents after his arrest, and true to form, Ross begins stalking again in earnest, and his thoughts are still consumed with murder and rape. and his next victim lived less than a mile from his house, and that was Tammy Williams, who was 17.
She actually knew him.
She knew him from high school.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
So I'm sure in a town that small anyway, you would know a lot of the locals.
That's right. And since she knew him, he claimed that's why he had to kill her, basically.
Right, which I'm sure was not I'm sure he would have killed her anyway.
That's right. So she was missing for 2.5 years, and it really did change that little town in Connecticut.
Oh, it did. I mean, prior to that, people didn't lock their doors. They really had a feeling of being in this safe, peaceful community, and after that happened, that all changed.
Like, people started locking their doors.
Yeah, and they were kind of wary of their neighbors because nobody knew who it was.
That's right. And so his next victim in March of 1982, this one, I don't know why, Paula Pereiro just really, oh my God, have you seen her picture? She's such a they're all, it just breaks my heart. But
well, I think I related to her a little too because they said she was a real wild child.
Totally. Yeah, no, exactly. Me too. I can totally see being like, hey, screw you, Mom and Dad, I'm hitchhiking.
Right.
You know?
And she loved meeting colorful people, and she believed the best in everybody. So despite warnings from friends, she
would say I just don't let the creepy people pick me up, which is the problem with someone like Ross, because he doesn't present as creepy. He presents as some normal business guy who's gonna give these girls a ride, and he's just doing the next right thing, and it's no, he's a total monster behind this very normal facade.
Actually, Sarah, on his previous attack, he attacked the girl wearing a suit.
Oh, it's a perfect cover if you think about it.
Right.
You know, he's not with tattoos with a beard down to his chest, and
his next attack is a little surprising because he actually stalks an off-duty policewoman.
That's bold.
And he knocks on her door and asks if he could use the phone, and she reluctantly lets him in after asking for ID, and he actually provides his real ID, which shows me that he was planning on killing her, obviously, because she would never be able to ID him, but kind of surprising she let him in. But he immediately attacked her, and she was actually able to pull his hair, which made him lose his footing, and as she ran for her gun, he ran away.
And again, he's given this total slap on the wrist, even though this is the second serious assault that the police are aware of. He gets 1 month in prison. That's nothing.
And actually, by this time his parents had been divorced, and his lawyer uses this as, he's a grown man at this point, but the lawyer uses this as an excuse for his behavior.
After his tiny stint in prison, he's released back to Brooklyn, Connecticut, where he immediately picked up his old habits.
Okay, so on June 15th, 1982, Deborah Smith Taylor and her husband were driving home, and they had been out partying, and they ran out of gas. They got into a big fight, and she actually stormed off. I think they both stormed off. I don't think he took it too super seriously at the time. He just figured, she would be okay. And that was the last time she was seen alive. Her body would be found 3 months later, and Deborah was only 23 years old. So just starting her life.
I think it's interesting to note, too, that there is some passage of time between the victims, and what Ross apparently would kind of try to resist these impulses.
We learn later from his own words that he did fight these impulses, and then something would often trigger him and he would give in.
And so in November of 1983, he picked up Robin Stavinsky, who was a very bubbly 19-year-old from Norwich, Connecticut, and killed her.
Yeah, she was last seen, walking home from work, which was just a normal thing, safe area, and her body was found near the Norwich Hospital by a jogger.
And I think law enforcement is not putting these cases together yet.
There is some behavior now is going to start to pick up and escalate as far as time frames go, because his next victim will be about 8 months later on April 22nd, 1984.
We've talked about it too. I think these next two victims are really difficult to talk about. I think in part because I have a daughter who's this age, but these two particularly are difficult.
These are two tough ones, and
because his crimes are escalating.
The frequency is escalating, and April Brunias and Leslie Shelley were just the absolute best of friends. They considered themselves sisters. They even had made a fake birth certificate so that they could be official sisters.
Right, and they're typical teens. Tell their parents that they're going to the movies, and they tell their parents they have a ride home, which is BS. And unfortunately, they hitchhiked home with Ross.
Hitchhiking was a lot more common in the 70s and then even in the early 80s, so I don't think there was the same level of fear associated with it.
So a serial killer like Ross is going to take advantage of that naivete.
Right. This crime, I'm not going to get into the details on this crime because it's actually really a bit too brutal, and because he does murder both of them, and he brutally rapes and murders both of them, and
I think he's completely out of control at this point.
Yeah,
his behavior is escalating, and it's only 2 months later when Ross encounters his final victim. And it's so chilling to listen to him talk about stalking the victims, because he says, once I saw her, she was dead. That's what in his own words. This is Wendy Baribeau. This is his final victim. And how old was Wendy? She was 17.
She was 17.
17, right.
And I also want to mention that his final three, April, Leslie, and Wendy, are all from Griswold.
Okay. Which is very close to his house.
Right. So
yes. So he's practicing geolocation.
Right. So this was obviously completely would shock this community.
I think he's very blatant with Wendy. He does it in a very public thoroughfare. There's several witnesses who saw his car, and they see this white male struggling with a young female getting into the car. And the blatancy of this would actually be the downfall of Ross.
Yeah, he is totally out of control at this point. I mean, he almost appears he doesn't even care if he gets caught. I mean, to grab her in broad day.
Part of him probably, not to say, he's a serial killer with a conscience. I think he does still feel guilt. And I think he knows enough to know what he's doing is messed up. And I think he wanted to get caught at this point.
Yeah, and
he's smart enough. I think he could have gotten away with a lot more and really been a Ted Bundy. I am not giving him any positive attributes that he doesn't deserve, but I think he did it so blatantly that he was caught. And part of how they caught him, Laura, was that the witnesses, they see this blue Toyota, right? Mm-hmm. They see this blue Toyota, and Connecticut police go ahead and they run all the blue Toyotas, in their database, basically.
Which is over 3,000.
Over 3,000. Right. But he's so close that he's probably one of the first logical people to talk to.
I think, if not the first. I mean, that's how close the proximity was.
That's right. Yeah, that's right.
And when Michael Melchek assigned chief investigator after the murder of Wendy Baribeau, and I think that's maybe when they're starting to put everything together.
Sure.
And that would be in 1984. And so they have quite a few witnesses, and this really kind of an interesting dynamic when he goes to interview Ross.
When Melchek goes and speaks to Ross.
Yes. I mean, because he doesn't suspect him.
He doesn't. I mean, Ross is, once again, very respectable insurance salesman kind of guy, mild manner. He doesn't fit the typical criminal profile.
Not at all. And it's actually Ross that starts to drop hints and kind of entice him into wanting to know more.
Because he talks about his former things that he was arrested for,
right, which
are
is
of sexual nature.
Super bizarre. I mean, if you didn't want to be a suspect, you wouldn't admit to your prior bad acts.
That's right, yeah.
Melchek immediately his spidey senses go up, and he immediately decides to bring him down to the precinct, and Ross agrees. It's some pretty good, I'd say impressive. I mean, you do this in somewhat of a different way, but maybe you can talk to how he really kind of endears himself to Ross.
Oh, absolutely. Melchek really ingratiates himself with Ross, and they're talking about everything. They're talking about relationships, and he's kind of doing the good cop, I'm your buddy kind of thing, and that's when Ross confesses not only to Wendy Baribeau's murder, but also to 7 more murders. And I bet Melchek was just shocked. I bet he was shocked that Wendy, let alone 7 more murders. He's got a serial killer, basically Connecticut's only serial killer, in front of him in that interview room. It must have just been astonishing.
He almost seems relieved to finally be caught, and he confesses openly and freely, and he almost enjoys talking about his experience, and he will wind up getting convicted of 4 of these murders.
And that's enough to give him the death penalty in Connecticut, though.
Which, I mean, we live in the Northeast. It's almost shocking that the death penalty was even used, would be given to somebody even in the 80s. But it was.
Because nobody had been executed in Connecticut since 1960.
So, I mean, it had been a long, long time. But Ross would go to death row and spend 18 years on death row.
I just want to back up, too, and say that there was really sort of no contest. It took the jury 86 minutes of deliberation to convict him.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't even get into the trial because he confesses, and it really becomes more of a capital, because it's a capital case. They have to, even if you confess, you still have to have a sentencing hearing.
Right.
So they decide unanimously that he deserves the death penalty.
And he agrees with this as well.
He does, not as much initially as he will come to in time, but yes, he does have, like you said, he's kind of, and it does sound odd to say that, but he's extremely introspective for a killer, and he does recognize that he's, in a sense, a monster.
So Laura, even when Ross was in prison, he was still haunted by all of these fantasies, and he would relive his murders in fantasy, and he'd basically get off on them, and he was still kind of tortured by all of this until he got help.
Yeah, there's actually even a instance where he was near a female guard, and he was so overtaken by his compulsions that he
to hurt her
that he actually ran away from her, and she
yelled out.
But he did that to avoid harming her. I don't want it to make it seem as though I don't understand what a monster Ross was, and I think, as you've pointed out, law enforcement officers and people who dealt with him in prison were very, very aware of how dangerous he was.
In fact, there's a quote from one of the officers involved regarding somebody like Ross. He said, "You were involved in a case with a suspected criminal. You realize that they can often be quite noteworthy adversaries. These criminals are psychopathic, cunning, and sophisticated liars. The sadist views himself as more intelligent than the rest of society, especially law enforcement personnel. Additionally, he has usually mastered the art of deception. Even if he is confronted with hard evidence, he will invariably rationalize his actions. He will not be moved by pleas for compassion because he's unable to feel guilt. And in fact, somebody like Ross, the difference is, my understanding at least, is the difference is a normal person, when they see another person in pain, they feel empathy. A sexual sadist and psychopath like Ross, that's actually gives him excitement." Dr. Fred Berlin figures in for this case for Ross. And who is Dr. Berlin?
Dr. Berlin's an American psychiatrist and sexologist, and he is one of the leading experts in sex offenders and in chemical castration, which is really his area of expertise.
Isn't his whole, what you were telling me, is his philosophy is basically these are people who suffer from grave mental illnesses, and that this is treatable and should be treated as such.
Right, he sees that the alternative is much worse, that most sex offenders will re-offend, so that as a society, he's of the view that we're better off treating people because most of them will be re-released into society, monitoring them, and treating it really almost like an illness.
But he also deals with sexual sadists, and most notably, he worked on the Jeffrey Dahmer case.
Yeah.
And so Dr. Berlin was really instrumental in treating Michael Ross, and here's what Berlin had to say about Ross.
In talking with Mr. Ross, he would, in terms of everyday relationships, have respect for other people. Where he began to have difficulty is in situations where he would begin to feel sexual arousal. What he had said to me is that for as long as he could remember, when it came to be sexually aroused, he was plagued with these fantasies, with these urges, with these thoughts about wanting to harm and subjugate and even murder women. And this was extremely arousing for him. I remember him telling me at one point he would try to talk himself out of leaving his home for fear that when he left his home, these thoughts would be there and he'd have the urge to go out and stalk women with these thoughts running through his head. It became clear to me very early, both in terms of a knowledge of what Mr. Ross had done and in terms of what he was telling me, that he was very likely a sexually disordered individual. In other words, it's very likely that his sexual makeup was very different from the norm. Any man is certainly capable physically of assaulting a woman and even of murdering her, but the average man is not having intense recurrent sexual fantasies and urges about doing so, and certainly not having those fantasies and urges to the point where it's a daily struggle to prevent himself from acting in such a fashion. Mr. Ross was describing these kinds of recurrent abnormal sexual fantasies for me, and it was almost a textbook description of what is in the psychiatric literature of someone who has the sexual disorder of sexual sadism.
So after Berlin basically diagnoses Ross, and Ross decided that chemical castration would be the best treatment for him.
And teamed with psychoanalysis.
Right, not in itself, exactly.
And being treated with
Depo-Provera, which is really what Berlin specializes in. So Sarah, maybe you could tell us a little bit about Depo-Provera. It's arousal, right.
What Depo-Provera does is it reduces testosterone levels. It's actually, ironically, a birth control for women as well, but it reduces testosterone levels in males, and it is commonly called chemical castration. I didn't really realize this, but there are a number of states that require certain sex offenders to be chemically castrated. I think it's California, Texas, Alabama now has new legislation about it. And basically it lowers libido. It's called an anaphrodisiac, meaning away from aphrodisiac.
Right.
And it curbs sexual desire.
These men are still able to perform sexually, but the compulsion is greatly cut down. So Berlin, he's a pretty controversial character.
Well, I think the whole concept of chemical castration is pretty controversial. Just focusing on Ross, I think what it did is it relieved Ross. According to Ross, and I have a tendency I do believe him, because I feel like if Ross was trying to get clemency, or if he was lobbying for a number of appeals and this kind of like, hallelujah, I'm saved kind of thing, which you do see with a lot of lifers or people on death row. But he's not. He was lobbying for his own death. In fact, he hired attorneys to assist him with speeding up. He was like, this is
more of a punishment.
More of a punishment for me. What I'm saying is I think he has a lot of credibility in that he says that he got a lot of relief through treatment.
He's still a monster. He still has fantasies and compulsions, and they're just lessened. But it does enable him to begin to read, to begin to do other things.
Wait, to read? No.
Just read novels, to
Right, it takes his mind off
of... He's not plagued so much by these continuous... Berlin likens it to an addict, with the constant thought of the drug, which was so disruptive.
No, the constant thought of the fantasies.
Right, but no, I'm likening it to a drug addict.
I see.
With the thought process.
Gotcha.
And this reduced sex drive now enabled him to do other things.
Because remember, he's also highly intelligent. And Ross himself will sort of say, like, the volume on the fantasies, it was like having like a stereo like on 10 all the time. And so what this drug did for him was just reduce the volume down so that he could focus on other things. He's highly intelligent. He wasn't translating math and science texts into Braille. He was learning Braille, basically, and so he was doing this from his death row cell.
Right. It's quite apparent when he talks about his crimes, though, that he still does get a rush and somewhat
he's still a monster.
He's still, he does get kind of excited discussing his infamy. But it does enable him. Now, I'm a libertarian, so me, I'm for really firm punishments for sex offenders, but this does cross a lot of lines. And
well, I think also some of the arguments that are against chemical castration was that you can't use a medical procedure as a punishment. But I think in the case of Ross, he wants some relief.
Well, I'm actually, and I think that Berlin is of that school of thought where he wants to help people who, much like addiction, who want that help. And, chemical castration has historically been abused.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, there was, with eugenics, there was a time where prisoners were castrated and sterilized so that they wouldn't, there was this thought that they would reproduce more criminals. So I think it's something we definitely have to be aware of. But I think Berlin does give us an insight into the affliction of a sex offender that was kind of an awakening for me.
It's true. And I do think that the argument about chemical castration and the death penalty kind of dovetail in a way. Laura, I think you would probably, as a libertarian, I think you would probably agree with my argument against something like chemical castration or the death penalty is that I don't want the state to come in and dictate whether people should be killed for their crimes or whether they should be physically or chemically castrated. I don't want the state having that right.
I have to say I agree, and I like many things, may change my mind on that. Although I've had a murder in my family. It was my husband's brother, and he and I feel differently about the death penalty. I want to be sensitive to the fact that people who have had different experiences feel differently about this.
Well, and in a very practical way, if the death penalty were effective, then great.
Right, it's not a deterrent.
It's not a deterrent.
But I won't get off on I could talk about the death penalty all day, but I won't. So Ross does wind up spending 18 years in entirety on death row, and he reconnects with his faith. He says the rosary every day. I'm not sure that he has the capability to really experience true remorse, or if he's feigning that. And as you said, he doesn't fight his own execution. He almost welcomes death and feels he's been forgiven by God. So he kind of takes this, we see this often in prison.
But I just want to also speak briefly to the fact that Ross had such the trifecta for being a serial killer. Okay, he had a mentally ill mother who was extremely critical and abusive of him. He was sexually abused by his uncle. He was killing chickens at the age of 8 because that was his job. He was urinating in the bed until his early teens.
He exhibited, sociopathic behavior young. He showed a disregard for others, no conscience, guilt, or shame,
But you wonder with somebody like Ross, who was intelligent, whether if he had gotten help early on, or one of those things were not in place. And he's very adamant about what I kind of appreciated about what Ross had to say was he was very adamant that he was like, please do not blame my mother or my childhood on this. This is all me. He owns it, which is refreshing because I think oftentimes people really do delve into their childhoods and try to make it about that. But on the face of it, he really has. He is like, if you were to put together a recipe for a serial killer, Michael Bruce Ross is it.
Yeah, he really had them all. And I think that he would probably admit that nobody is safe around him if he's not locked up. This by no means, the chemical castration, like you said, this doesn't medically change your brain makeup. So, I mean, he was still a pedophile. He still had these fantasies. They were just diminished. He would not fight his execution. And
that's right, and he fought them the whole way. He did not.
Actually, interesting little anecdote, one of those attorneys who tried to file for him, he later sent a note to, which was opened at a later time, which I'll give you the punchline of a little bit later.
Oh, you're such a tease.
Yeah. He spends this time on death row, and there hasn't been a death penalty carried out in Connecticut since 1960. So this is a really controversial case, and you have people really on both sides that are really pretty vocal about their feelings about this execution being carried out.
Even one of his intended victims spoke out against him being executed. I believe.
He waived his final rights to appeal, and Ross was executed in Somers, Connecticut at the Osborne Correctional Institution. And outside there were a massive amount of people both for his execution, praising it, and protesting the death penalty. And this would be the last execution Connecticut has seen since. And my punchline is that upon opening this note after he was executed, Ross had written to his attorney, checkmate, meaning he won in the end. And that was, perhaps this was him having control until the bitter end. He had no final words. He didn't pick a elaborate final meal. He just went to his death. That's Michael David Ross. I mean, a very fascinating serial killer, and the only serial killer that I'm aware of that went to an Ivy League school.
We are Ivy League Murders. Our music is composed by Russell Jarvis. Our researcher is Christy Wagner. We're all from Cambridge, repping 38. If you'd like to support us, please do the following. Hit the subscribe button, give us 5 stars, tell your friends to listen, and support us on our Patreon, where you can find us under Ivy League Murders.